The British soldiers standing silently, shoulder deep in the water off the beaches of Dunkirk and waiting to be evacuated, probably never imagined that 4 years later they would land on the nearby Normandy beaches to return to the European continent, avenge their defeat, and personally bury the Nazi Third Reich. Articles, films, and TV shows about the Dunkirk evacuation Operation Dynamo are already countless, and the release of Christopher Nolan's film Dunkirk has put that piece of history firmly in the spotlight. The Allies' organized withdrawal, the courageous participation of the British public, the stubborn resistance of the rear guard, and Hitler's mysterious order for his panzer divisions to halt are all frequent topics of discussion among military history buffs and have become enduring subjects of debate. But there are some lesser-known historical facts. Where did the evacuated troops actually go? What was the real impact of the Dunkirk evacuation on the overall course of World War II? The common account is that from May 26 to June 4, 1940, a total of 338,000 British and French soldiers were evacuated, effectively pulling the British Expeditionary Force BEF out of France and the Low Countries after a 9-month deployment. In reality, while the majority of the BEF 224,320 men was evacuated from Dunkirk, a significant number of troops remained outside the encirclement and were not withdrawn. To support the wavering French government and encourage its army to keep fighting, Britain even formed and sent what was unofficially called a second BEF. However, the situation was irreversible. The main body of the French army had been crushed, its strategic reserves were nowhere to be found, and the German offensive was relentless. Marshal Pétain replaced Prime Minister Reynaud, who had wanted to fight to the end, and surrendered to Germany on June 17th. Under the armistice terms, the entire Atlantic coast of France was to become a German-occupied zone, making the rescue of the remaining British forces in France an urgent and dangerous mission before the Germans arrived. Aside from a few rear guard units tasked with delaying the enemy, other British forces raced ahead of the Germans. From June 11th to 13th, a total of 11,059 British troops were successfully evacuated from the port of Le Havre in what was called Operation Cycle. Operation Ariel was on a much larger scale. Small-scale, unofficial evacuations even continued from French Mediterranean ports until August 14th. According to British official historian L.F. Ellis's 1953 statistics, by August 14th, an additional 191,870 personnel had been evacuated. Combined with Dunkirk, the total number of successful evacuees reached 558,032, including 368,491 British troops. The French First Army, which had retreated to the Dunkirk area, was tasked with holding back the Germans, covering the withdrawal of British and some French forces. If the new French commander-in-chief Vagon, who had replaced Gamelin, already had friction with the British, the Dunkirk evacuation escalated this tension and brought it into the open. According to the British, they had long advocated for equal rights for British and French troops to use the evacuation ships, but Vagon only gave the order to retreat on the morning of May 29th. The French, however, widely believed that the British were selfishly focused only on saving their own troops, putting their allies in a perilous position. Indeed, there were incidents where British soldiers forcibly prevented French troops from boarding ships. Vagon complained that the British hadn't counterattacked decisively at Arras, which led to the failure of the French relief effort. He also pointed out caustically, as early as March 1918, they wanted to get on the boats, because they don't know how to resist the lure of the seaports. While such an accusation was unfair, it vividly reflects the hurt that the BEF's withdrawal caused for many in France. To some extent, this gave Pétain, Vagon, and others a pretext to seek an armistice with Germany. This event, combined with the later British naval attack on the French fleet in North Africa that caused heavy casualties and the seizure of French ships docked in British ports, made many sectors of French society extremely hostile to Britain and the Allied cause. So much so that when General de Gaulle called for continued resistance, very few answered. Of the tens of thousands of French soldiers, sailors, and airmen stranded in Britain, only about 1,400 joined the Free French forces under the Cross of Lorraine. It wasn't until the French Expeditionary Force evacuated from Narvik, mainly the 1st Battalion of the 13th Demi Brigade of the Foreign Legion, about 900 men arrived in Britain, that they formed the backbone of the Free French Army. From May 29th to June 4th, A total of 139,097 French soldiers were evacuated from Dunkirk. They were temporarily housed in camps across southern England, where they were supplied and hosted by various organizations. But France was still fighting, so at the request of the French government, the vast majority were shipped back to France within a week. About half of them returned to the front lines, only to be killed, wounded, or captured within weeks. Only about 3,000 chose to remain in Britain. Another 18,246 French troops were evacuated during the subsequent Operation Ariel, though their ultimate fate is unknown. In short, for France, the Dunkirk evacuation deepened the mistrust and even resentment that many people felt toward Britain. This only began to change after the Germans started their brutal exploitation of the occupied territories. The Free French movement gained momentum, and the Allies returned to Europe as liberators. So why are these rescued British troops often called an elite force? After World War I, Britain believed there would be no major wars for the foreseeable future, leading to drastic cuts in the army's size and budget, effectively putting its military out to pasture. The 10-year rule acted like a straitjacket on British defense development. Even after the rule was abolished in 1932, new military spending was directed mainly toward the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, while the Army's limited funds were squeezed by the costs of building up home air defenses. The policy of limited liability toward the European continent turned the British Army into a small, highly mobile, professional force, sacrificing firepower for mobility and focusing primarily on defending the homeland and its colonies. When World War II broke out, Britain could only send its 4 regular infantry divisions and parts of 1 armored division from its home-based army. Although it served with the rest of the I Corps as the rear guard covering the BEF's retreat, under the calm command of the new I Corps commander, Alexander, it returned to Britain largely intact. In late February 1943, the division was sent to North Africa for the final phase of the Tunisian campaign. During the Battle of Medjez El Bab, the 1st Division, with artillery and Churchill tank support, repelled an attack by Germany's Hermann Göring Panzer Division. The division fought in a series of difficult battles until the final surrender of Axis forces in North Africa. In December 1943, the 1st Division joined the Italian campaign, first under Montgomery's British 8th Army and later under Clark's U.S. 5th Army, participating in the costly Anzio landings and the Battle of Monte Cassino before being withdrawn from Italy in January 1945. The 2nd Infantry Division suffered very few casualties during its withdrawal to Britain. It was then stationed in Yorkshire, where it refitted and prepared to defend against a possible German amphibious invasion. With Japan's entry into the war, Commonwealth forces in the Far East suffered repeated defeats, and the situation became critical. The 2nd Division was transferred to India, which was threatened by both the Japanese army and internal unrest, and took part in operations against the Japanese in India and Burma, including the relief of Imphal and the Battle of Kohima, known as the Stalingrad of the East, shattering the Japanese dream of conquering the Indian subcontinent. Under Montgomery's command, the 3rd Infantry Division earned the nickname the Iron Division. During the months of the Phoney War, Montgomery subjected his men to rigorous training, which resulted in the division having the lowest casualty rate and being considered one of the best-performing British divisions in the Battle of France. The composition of the 3rd Division changed several times after its return to Britain, but it always maintained its formidable fighting strength. On June 6, 1944, exactly 4 years after the Dunkirk evacuation, the 3rd Division was the first British unit to land on Sword Beach in Normandy. After D-Day, the division fought its way through the battle for Caen, the Falaise Pocket, the advance from Paris to the Rhine, and campaigns in the Netherlands and Belgium, eventually pushing into Germany itself. In the campaign from Sword Beach to Bremen, the 3rd Division suffered 2,586 killed and over 12,000 wounded. After the war in Europe ended, the 3rd Division was selected to form a Commonwealth Corps with an Anzac and a Canadian division to prepare for the invasion of the Japanese home islands alongside U.S. forces, an operation that was never carried out due to Japan's surrender. The 4th Infantry Division, one of the regular home-based divisions, was assigned to Alan Brooks II Corps within the BEF. After suffering heavy casualties, the division returned to Britain and spent the next 2 years resting, refitting, training, and serving in an anti-invasion role. In June 1942, the division was experimentally converted into a mixed division, with 1 infantry brigade replaced by a tank brigade. In early 1943, The 4th Division arrived in North Africa and was thrown into the Tunisian campaign, participating in the final offensive against Axis forces, codenamed Operation Vulcan. It arrived on the Italian front in February 1944, relieving the British 46th Infantry Division, and distinguished itself in the 4th and final Battle of Monte Cassino. It later fought hard to break the Gothic line. The 5th Infantry Division deployed 2 of its infantry brigades to France after the war began, with the divisional headquarters and 3rd Brigade crossing the Channel later. The division exchanged units with Territorial Army divisions that arrived later to improve their combat effectiveness. But despite this, the 5th Division maintained the strength of a regular division. After the German offensive began, the 5th Division fought effectively in Belgium and France, including the counterattack at Arras supported by Matilda tanks of the 1st Army Tank Brigade, which surprised the Germans and stalled their advance. The division's successful defense of the Ypres-Commune Canal covered the BEF's retreat and earned praise from 2 Corps Commander Brooke. Most of the division arrived in Britain on June 1st. After suffering heavy casualties, the 5th Division spent 21 months recovering in Britain. For most of 1940, it was stationed in Scotland, training and preparing for an anti-invasion role. In 1941, it was moved to Northern Ireland to defend against a possible German amphibious invasion, codenamed Operation Green. The 5th Division was subsequently deployed all over the world, becoming one of the most widely traveled British divisions. Part of the division took part in the invasion of French Madagascar. After August 1942, the 5th Division was stationed in India and the Middle East before being assigned to the 13 Corps of the 8th Army in Egypt in 1943. It participated in Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, and then fought on the Italian mainland until March 1945, when it was transferred to Western Europe for the final campaign into Germany. As for the loss of weapons and supplies, although the BEF lost most of its artillery, tanks, vehicles, fuel, and baggage, some equipment and materials were still saved during Operation Ariel and other withdrawals, including 322 artillery pieces, 4,739 vehicles, 533 motorcycles, 32,303 long tons of ammunition, 33,060 long tons of stores, and 1,071 long tons of gasoline, plus 13 light tanks and 9 cruiser tanks. For a Britain facing the threat of German invasion and severely lacking equipment, these supplies were a desperately needed lifeline. On the other hand, much of the abandoned equipment, like the 2-pounder anti-tank guns and 3-inch howitzers, was obsolete and unsuited for modern warfare, with some even dating back to World War I. Many of the trucks were requisitioned civilian vehicles. These losses and the lessons of the Battle of France forced Britain to design and produce weapons better suited for modern warfare to equip its army. The 17-pounder and 25-pounder guns, more balanced tanks, and American Lend-Lease weapons all dramatically increased the British Army's combat effectiveness, eventually turning it into a force capable of standing up to and defeating the German army. Finally, it must be said that the success of the Dunkirk evacuation was a massive boost to the morale and resolve of the British military and public. Before the US and the Soviet Union entered the war, Britain and the Commonwealth nations were the main force resisting Axis aggression. If the entire BEF at Dunkirk had been wiped out by German armored divisions, it's possible that the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force alone could not have prevented a German crossing of the English Channel, which is only about 20 miles wide at its narrowest point. The British government might have been forced to relocate to Canada, and the Allies would have had to cross the vast Atlantic to retake Europe. History would have been rewritten. Therefore, in a very real sense, it can be said, without Dunkirk, there would have been no Normandy.